Efendim anne? İyi anne, sen ne yaptın? Açım biraz sanki. Evet. Hı hı. Tamam. Tamam ya, bakarım ben.
Efendim anne? İyi anne, sen ne
Görüşürüz.
yaptın? Açım biraz sanki. Evet. Hı hı.
Evet, merhaba. Canlı yayını niye açtım? Çünkü eee, bu yayında kimmiş lan? Ben bilmiyorum. Bu yayında evet, biliyorum, bu yayını kimse izlemeyecek zaten, abone sayım 1 falan. Ama hem bir yayın deneyimi yok. Nasıl açılıyor falan. Şu an OBS Studio'dan ilk defa yayın açtım. Nasıl yayın açıldığını öğrendim. Eee, Şimdi amacımız CS50 kursunun. Bir dakika, şimdi annem falan gelirse bunu nasıl mute edeceğimi de bilmiyorum. Ayarlar mı? Ya şöyle, herhalde şuradan susturur. Bir dakika, bir deneyeceğim. Deneme yapacağım. Bir dakika, şimdi annem falan gelirse bunu nasıl mute edeceğimi de bilmiyorum. Ayarlar mı? Ya tamam, güzel. Çalışıyor. Şimdi asıl amacımız, bugünkü bu yayında amacımız CS50'de, yani bu Harvard Üniversitesi'nin bir Harvard Üniversitesi'nin bir eğitim seti diyelim. Introduction to Programming
Tamam,
olarak
güzel.
geçiyor.
Çalışıyor. Şimdi asıl amacımız
Nerede o kurs?
yayında amacımız
Şunların hiçbirisini izlemeyeceğim.
CS50'de, yani bu Harvard Üniversitesi'nin.
Hiçbirisini izlemeyeceğim. Çünkü yani çoğunu biliyorum ben. Unit testinin ne olduğunu bilmiyorum ama buna bir bakarız bir ara. Ama şu anki asıl amacım Object Oriented Programming'in ne olduğunu anlamak. Çünkü Object Oriented Programming ne? Hiçbir fikrim yok. Yani e, bildiğim Paint açayım. Paint. Bildiğim tek şey var. Object Oriented Programming. Çok kısıtlı bir bilgi. E, Nesneler var. Tamam mı? Mesela diyelim ki öğrenci nesnesi var. Öğrenci. Bu öğrenci nesnesi. Öğrenci. Yazımı çok iyi. Öğrenci nesnesinin içerisinde mesela ismi var. Name. Ondan sonra class, sınıfı, age. Tamam. Yani bildiğim tek şey bu. Böyle bir şey varmış. Hani buna da obje deniyormuş. Yani ne oluyor? Neden? Yani bu ne işe yarıyor? Bunun obje olmasının bize faydası ne? Neyi kolaylaştırıyor? Hangi sorunu çözüyor? Hiçbir fikrim yok. Yani kullandığımız yerler var mı bilmiyorum. Yani şimdi şöyle, e, kullandığım yerler vardı. Kullandığım yer neresiydi? Şöyle belirteyim. Mesela öğrenci dedik ya. E, Öğrenci, şimdi Python'da kod yazıyoruz diyelim. Öğrenci noktaya bastığımda hemen şurada 3 tane şey çıkacak. Yani 3 tane şey, hangisi demek istediğiniz? Name mi, class mı, age mi? Mesela öğrenci nokta name eşittir Ali. Yani öğrenci nokta name'i Ali'ye eşitledim. Ama bu bana nasıl bir fayda sağlıyor? Bu bana yani kafamda tam oturmuş bir mevzu değil. Kafamda tam oturmadığı için şey yapmak istedim yani. Hem bunu kendi başıma çalışırken çok atlayabiliyorum. İşte videoları geçiyorum, onu yapıyorum, bunu yapıyorum, dakikaları geçiyorum. Şimdi canlı yayında kendi kendime, ya zaten bu videoyu kimse izleyeceği yok. Ama hadi ola ki böyle sonradan birisi izliyor olsun. Bir saniye. Evet. Evet. Asıl amacımız, şu unit testin olayını bir yerde duymuştum ama neyse. Anlattığım gibi yani bunu Object Oriented Programming'in böyle bu çok introduction kısmını çok az bir şekilde biliyorum. E, Ama daha derinini öğrenmek için e, bunu canlı yayında şey yapmaya karar verdim. İşte 8 dakika falan oldu şimdi. Unit testin olayını bir yerde duymuştum ama neyse. Anlattığım gibi yani bunu Object Oriented Programming'in çok Evet, bugün canlı yayında bunu hep beraber izleyeceğiz. Bu telif falan yer miyim bilmiyorum. Yersem bile artık. Yani çok bir şey kaybetmem, video kaldırırım yani. Çok önemli değil benim için. Zaten milyonlar falan bir kişi bile izlemiyor yani öyle söyleyeyim. Bakalım. Kahvem de yanında. Hadi o halde başlayalım. Etkileyici.
Alright, this is CS50's Introduction to Programming with Python. My name is David Malin, and this is our week on Object-Oriented Programming, or OOP. It turns out that in the world of programming, there's different paradigms of programming languages. There's different ways of solving problems with code, and it's a little hard to see this at first if you've only learned one language, but over
Yorum olunca yediklerimde bitince açar.
time, if and when you learn other languages besides Python, you'll start to notice certain patterns and certain capabilities of some languages but not another. Thus far, within the world of Python, you and I have largely been writing code that's procedural in nature, whereby we're writing procedures, we're writing functions, and we're sort of doing things top to bottom. Everything is step by step by step, as you would expect in general from an algorithm. But along the way, we've actually dabbled in another paradigm known as functional programming with Python, whereby we've been able to pass functions around. We even had an anonymous function some weeks ago, and that's evidence of features of a functional programming language, even though we've just scratched the surface thereof. Today, we focus on another paradigm, and this one in more detail, namely object-oriented programming. And now, while some of you might have prior programming experience and have learned languages like Java, which are by design fundamentally object-oriented, Python indeed allows you a bit of flexibility when it comes to how you solve problems with code. But it turns out OOP, object-oriented programming, is a pretty compelling solution to problems that you invariably encounter as your programs get longer, larger, and more complicated. So indeed, OOP, for our purposes, is going to be a solution to a problem that builds on so many of the lessons past. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's start by writing a program very procedurally by opening up VS Code here. I'm going to go ahead and create a program called student.py. And in this program, I want to do something relatively simple initially, as we might have done some weeks ago now, where I just ask a user for their name and maybe in the context of the Harry Potter universe, their house, and just print out where that student is from. And let's gradually enhance this program by adding more and more features to it and see if we don't stumble upon problems that up until now we might not have had very elegant, well-designed solutions to, but if we introduce explicitly object-oriented programming as a programming technique, I bet we can clean up our code and set the stage for writing even more sophisticated programs, longer programs down the line. So in student.py, let me go ahead and do a name variable, setting it equal to the return value of input, and just prompt the user for their name like this. And then let me go ahead and do the same for a house variable and prompt the user for their house using input like this. And let's do something super simple now. Let's just go ahead and print out an F string that says something like name from house, just so that I can confirm that the contents of these variables are indeed as I expect. I'm not going to do any error checking or trimming or anything like that for now. I'm really just going to spit back out whatever the user just typed.
Şu yapının ne olduğunu tam bilmiyorum. Ne bu ya? İlk defa gördüm böyle bir şey. F name from house. Ne? Yani gerçekten ilginçmiş.
Typed in. All right, let me go ahead and run Python of student.py. Let's use our go-to, like Harry, as in Harry Potter, from Gryffindor. And when I hit enter now, let's see if I see that Harry from Gryffindor is indeed the case. All right, so I think we have a working program at this point. But let's now introduce some of those lessons learned way back from week 0, where we started writing our own functions. Not necessarily because it solves the problem more correctly. I dare say this is correct as is, but it begins to give us building blocks that we can extend so as to solve more complicated programs. So let me go back up to student.py. And let's go ahead now and do this. Let's put the entire logic I just wrote inside of our typical method called main, and let me indent those 3 lines so that at least they're now combined into one main method. But instead of using input on line 2 and input on line 3, why don't we go ahead and assume for the moment that we've got some function called getName in the world, and let's go ahead and assume we've got another function like getHouse in the world that don't take parameters, but their purpose in life is, by their name, going to be to get the user's name and to get their user's house respectively. And then I'm going to print out the exact same F string as before. I, of course, need to implement these functions now, so let me go lower in my file and define a function called get_name. Nothing in these parentheses because it's not going to take a parameter. And I'm going to go ahead and do something like name equals input, quote-unquote name, just like before, and then I'm going to go ahead and return name. So it's a super simple function, but it's an abstraction. I now have a function called getName whose implementation details I don't have to care about anymore. I just know that the function exists. And I can tighten this up, in fact. I don't really need a name variable on line 8 if I'm immediately going to return that same name variable on line 9. So let me just tighten this up a little bit, even though it doesn't change the functionality, and just immediately return the return value of the inputs function call here. Let's do something very similar now for getHouse, which will similarly take no arguments. I'm going to go ahead and return the return value of input, this time prompting the user for their house. And I need one final detail at the very bottom. Let's continue our habit of doing if the name of this file equals quote unquote main, then let's go ahead and actually call main. And recall that we have that in place so that if this eventually becomes part of a module, a library of sorts, I don't accidentally call main blindly. I only do it if I mean to run main from the command line on this file. All right, so if I didn't make any mistakes here, let me go ahead and in my terminal window again run python of student.py, enter. Let's type in Harry, enter. Let's type in Gryffindor, enter. And we're set. Harry from Gryffindor seems to still be working. So we haven't really solved the problem any more correctly, but I've laid the foundation to maybe now do some more interesting things because I've had these building blocks in place. All right, but let me propose that we could be doing this a little bit differently. GetName, getHouse is fine, but at the end of the day, I'm really trying to get a student from the user. I want their name and their house, not just one or the other. So maybe it would be a little cleaner still to define a function called getStudent and let getStudent do all of this work for us. Now, theoretically, getStudent could call getName and could call getHouse, but because these functions are so short, I think I'm okay with just defining one function called getStudent that similarly won't take any arguments, but it's going to do two things. It's going to get the student's name by prompting them with input as before, and it's going to get the student's house by also prompting them as before. And then, now, I want to return the student, but I think I might have painted myself into a corner here because I now have two variables, name and house, and yet up until now, we've pretty much returned one or the other. We've returned one value. So any suggestions for how we can perhaps solve this problem that I just created for myself, whereby I want to return really a student, but I currently have a name variable and a house variable, I'd minimally like to return both of those.
I believe that we can return a dictionary, include the name and the house.
Yeah, so we absolutely could return a dictionary, a dict object in Python, whereby maybe one key is name, one key is house, and the values thereof are exactly the values of these variables. So we could totally do that. I worry that that might be getting a little complicated. I wonder if there's a simpler way. And instead, any other instincts, even if you're not sure it would work?
Return both name and house.
Return both name and house. I like the sound of that. It sounds simple. I don't have to figure out what a dictionary is going to look like. And in fact, this too would be a valid approach, even if you've not seen this before. It turns out in Python that you can kind of return multiple values, but that's a bit of a white lie. Or we could take Muhammad's approach of actually returning a dictionary and putting multiple keys therein. So here again, we have yet another example of how you can solve the same problem in at least two ways, and I dare say we're about to see even more. So one way you could solve this problem, whereby you want to return multiple values, would be to do something like this. I could go ahead and literally return not just name, but I could put a comma and also return house. This is not necessarily something you can do in other languages if you have programmed in other languages before. It depends on the language, but it looks like, thanks to this comma, maybe I can in fact return two values as actually proposed. Well, if I'm returning two values in this way on line 10, how do I get both values at the same time? Well, there's a couple of ways. Let me go up to my main function. I know minimally I'm going to have to change the get name and get house to get student, but what am I going to store the return value in? I think I could actually do this. And we have seen this technique before, where you can unpack, so to speak, sequences of values that are coming back. And indeed, consider this to be exactly that. Name, comma, house is some kind of sequence that I'm returning of values. Name, comma, house. So if I want to unpack those and store the return values in two separate variables, I can, in fact, use the commas on the left-hand side of my assignment operator, the equal sign, to do just that. Now, to be clear, I don't need to call these variables name and house here. I could simplify this and use just n here and h here, and then I could return just n and h. But I would argue that's not very clear to the reader as to what's going on. So I think in this case, even though it's a coincidence that I've used the same variable names in getStudent and getMain, and in main, it's a little more readable to someone like me. So I'm going to leave it as is. Well, let's go ahead and see now if this works. Let me clear my screen down here and run Python of student.py, enter. Let's again type in Harry. Let's again type in Gryffindor, enter. And voila, we still see that Harry is from Gryffindor. But what are we actually doing here? What are we actually doing by returning this value? Well, it turns out that what we've just done is used a tuple. Well, it turns...
Bu arada şu açıklamayı, yani şu kısmı yeni öğrendim. Yani fonksiyonlarda böyle bir benim Python'daki fonksiyon, yani şunu bilmiyorum. Şunu nasıl bir şey, bunu bilmiyorum. Ne işe yarıyor? Alt name eşittir main ne? Bunu bilmiyorum. Bu videoyu bitirdikten sonra bunda bir şeye not alayım. Hemen ona da bakalım. Name eşittir tire main tire. Bu nedir? Buna bak. Bu birinci notumuz olsun. Bunun kullanımının ne olduğunu bilmiyorum. Şunu da yeni öğrendim. Yani bunun iki farklı variable'a atanabildiğimizi yeni öğrendim.
Turns out that what we've just done is used a tuple. A tuple is...
Tuple dediğimiz şey ne? Şimdi bir düşüneyim. Şu an hatırlayamadım. Tuple sanki şeydi ya. İşte bool gibi bir veri yapısı şey gibi. Yani evet hayır ama tuple biraz daha farklı bir şey.
Another type of data in Python that's a collection of values, x, y, or x, y, z.
Ha şey,
It's similar in
aynen
spirit
şey
to a
gibi
list in
böyle
that sense.
3.5
But it's
falan gibi.
immutable. It's not mutable. Now, what does that mean? A list, as we've seen it before, is a data structure in Python that you can change the values of. You can go into bracket 0 for the first location and change the value there. You can go to bracket 1, bracket 2, bracket 3 and actually change the values.
Burada diyor ki adam değiştirebilir değil diyor. Yani mesela Python'daki listeler değiştirebilir. Mesela Python'da liste, işte bir liste 5 indekslik bir liste oluşturduk. Üçüncü indeksine gidip onu mesela 5'e eşitleyebiliyorsunuz ama tuple'la bunu yapamazsınız.
But if you have no intention of changing the values of variables and you want to return effectively multiple values, you don't have to even return it as a list, you can return it as a tuple instead, just by using a comma. And it turns out we can make explicit that, here's the white lie, I'm not actually returning two values per se. Whenever you use a comma in this way on line 9, you're actually returning one value, which is a tuple. Inside of that tuple now are two values. So it's similar in spirit to returning one list with two things. Here I'm returning one tuple with two things. And the mere fact that I've used a comma and nothing else tells Python that I indeed want to return a tuple. but there's more explicit syntax that we can use instead. I can actually more verbosely put explicit parentheses around the values of this tuple, just to make more clear to me, to the reader, that this isn't two values per se. This is one value with two things inside of it. And what I can actually do then, too, is I don't have to unpack this up here, so to speak. I can actually go up here and maybe give a more apt name, like student. And I can name the value, or rather name the variable in which I'm storing the return value of getStudent as, quote-unquote, student. So maybe this is a little better design now because I'm sort of abstracting away what a student is. It's implemented at the moment as a tuple with two values, but at least now I have a variable called what I mean, a student. But there's going to be a catch. On line 3, I still want to print out that student's name and their house, but I don't have a name variable anymore, and I don't have a house, and I also don't have a dictionary, as was proposed earlier, so I can't even go at those keys by name. But what a tuple is, it's very similar in spirit to a list, but it is indeed just immutable. And what I mean by that is I can still index into it numerically by saying student, square bracket 0, for the item in the first location in that tuple. And then over here, instead of house, I can say student bracket 1. Student bracket 1 is going to give me the second location in that tuple. Let me go ahead and clear my terminal window. Again, run python of student.py. Let's type in Harry. Let's type in Gryffindor, enter, and we still have some working code. Let me pause here now and see if there are any questions on this technique of returning a tuple and indexing into it in this way.
I guess this is like an actual use case where you would use a tuple versus, you know, a list or something else that's similar.
It's a really good question. When would you use a tuple versus a list? When you want to program defensively, or in general when you know that the values in this variable shouldn't change. So why would you use a data type that allows them to be changed? It just invites mistakes, bugs down the line, either by you or colleagues who are interacting with your code. So tuple is just another way where you can increase the probability of correctness by just not letting anyone, yourself included, change the contents therein. So it's just another tool in your toolkit. But let's make clear then what I mean by immutable. Again, I claim that immutable means that you cannot change the value. Well, let's go ahead and try to do this. Let me go ahead and run this program once more as is, python of student.py. Let me go ahead and type in, for instance, how about Padma's name. And I'm going to go ahead and say that Padma's in Gryffindor, as in the movies. And we see Padma from Gryffindor. But technically, I went down this rabbit hole and looking at Harry Potter more closely, technically in the books, Padma, I believe, was from Ravenclaw. So this is actually a mistake or an inconsistency between the movies and the books. Let's see if we can't fix this inconsistency in our code. So how about we do this? If the student's name that's inputted equals Padma, why don't we override whatever the house is and change it to be properly Gryffindor? Let me go ahead and do if student. Now, if I want to get at Padma's name, I'm going to have to do student bracket 0. I have to know what location the name is in this tuple. But if that value equals Padma, let's go ahead with this if statement and make a change. Let's change the student's bracket 1 value. So the second value, if we're 0 indexing, let's change it to be another house in the world of Harry Potter called Ravenclaw. So I'm just fixing maybe the user's input. They watch the movie, so they type in Padma Gryffindor, but in the books, it was Padma from Ravenclaw. All right, let me go ahead and go down to my terminal window, clear my terminal, and do python of student.py, enter. I'm going to do Harry as well as Gryffindor, just to demonstrate that that is still working as intended. Let me clear my screen again, though, and run python of student.py on Padma, and I'll put her, too, in Gryffindor, as in the movies, and hit enter. And now I just see a big mess of errors on the screen. Some kind of exception has been thrown, and indeed, a type error has happened. I'm using a data type wherein there's an error. And what is that error? Well, tuple object does not support item assignment. It's a little arcanely expressed, that's not really very user-friendly, but if you think about what those words mean, tuple object does not support item assignment. So assignment is copying from right to left, so somehow that's invalid, and here is a manifestation of the immutability of tuples. You cannot change location 0 or 1 or anything inside. That is a feature. That is the
Hata
design of a
alacak. Zaten
tuple.
aldı.
So if I
Bakalım.
want to override that, I think I'm going to have to use a different type of data that we've used
Muhtemelen
before, namely a list.
şunları
And that's
yapması mı
fine. If
tuple
you
yaptı
want to
bunu,
enable
yoksa
yourself and colleagues using your
bunu ayrı
code to
yapsa yine
change
tuple
the
olarak mı
contents of
alacaktı
that
kaydedecekti
container,
student
well, we can go ahead and return
şeyini
not a
verilince?
tuple using explicit parentheses or
Bunu
no
mesela
parentheses,
köşeli
just a
parantez
comma,
yapsa şey olur
but
mu?
I can
Liste
use
olur mu?
square brackets.
Dedim ve
If I'm
yaptı.
using square brackets on the left and the right, this is indeed explicitly a list. Same idea, but it's mutable. That is to say, you can change the
sayede
contents of a
değiştirebilecek
list.
diyor.
So making no other changes, just returning a list with square brackets instead of a tuple with parentheses or just the comma. Let me go ahead now and run python of student.py, enter. Let me type in Harry and Gryffindor again. That's still working. Good to see. Let me run this once more and type in Padma and Gryffindor, as in the movies, but no, now we've corrected it to be Padma from Ravenclaw, as in the books instead. Any questions now on tuples versus lists, or this idea of immutability versus mutability?
Can we use a nested tuple in Python, like a nest list?
Absolutely. You can have not only nested lists in Python, where one of the elements in a list could be another list. So you have some square brackets out here, you might have some other square brackets inside. You can absolutely do the same with a tuple as well. There's no constraint on the types of values you can put in there. We've not had occasion to do that in this case. I'm just returning a simple tuple with two elements, but yes, you could absolutely do that too. Other questions on tuples versus lists?
Okay, for example, when I say the square bracket, is it mainly used for the list?
Oh, a really good question. Sort of. So when you create a value, like a list, you use square brackets, and that would indeed be a visual indicator that this is definitely a list. If you instead see parentheses, that's a visual indicator when creating a value that it's definitely a tuple. However, somewhat confusingly, both lists and tuples use square brackets when you access the contents of them. When you index into them at location 0 or location 1, you always use square brackets.
Her
So
zaman
that's the
square bracket
distinction there.
kullanacaksın
Good
diyor. Güzel.
question. Allow me to propose now, if I may, that we solve this problem yet another
Yani
way,
bazen
and let's
binary
see if
emoji
we're either
olmuyor.
making things better
İki
or
tane değil,
for
mesela
worse than
MATLAB
this.
kullanınca MATLAB'da
Recall
square
that
bracket
dictionaries
kullanmıyorsun.
or dict
Çağırmak için
objects
şey
also
kullanıyorsun.
exist in
Normal
Python, and
parantez
a
kullanıyorsun.
dictionary
Bazen
is this
kafamı
collection of
karıştırıyor.
keys and values. And the upside in particular of a dictionary is that they have better semantics, right? You don't just have to assume that a name is always going to be at location 0, house is always going to be at location 1. I mean, that's the kind of thing, especially if you had 3, 4, or more values, eventually you or someone is going to get confused and forget what the order is, and you're going to write buggy code. So a dictionary is a little more powerful in that you can semantically associate keys, like little descriptions with the values, those keys and those values respectively. So let me go ahead and do this, and we can do this in a few different ways, but let me propose that we focus on getStudent here, and let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and delete the implementation of getStudent as is. Let me create a student variable and initialize it to an empty dictionary, and I can do that with just two curly braces here. And then let me go ahead and set two keys inside of that dictionary. Inside of the student, there will be quote-unquote a name key, and the value of that is going to be whatever the return value of input is when I prompt the user for their name. And then the house key inside of that same student dictionary is going to be the return value of whatever the user types in for their house. And lastly, I'm going to go ahead and return student. So now I am literally returning one thing still, but this time it's a dict rather than a tuple, rather than a list. But there's still two things in it, technically four things if you count the keys and the values, but there's two key value pairs. Now my code up here is going to have to change a little bit, and let's simplify this and remove, for instance, now the Padma if statement, just to focus on what's changing at hand. And let me go ahead now and leave line 2 alone. I'm still going to have a student variable that gets assigned the return value of getStudent, but what I want to do here now is actually access the keys inside of that dictionary, not by numeric index, which was for tuples and lists, 0 and 1, but by way of their keys. Now, normally, I might be in the habit, as I personally am, of using double quotes, quote-unquote name inside of there, and quote-unquote house inside of there, but before I even run this code, and show you a mistake, see an error on the screen, does anyone want to call out what I have done wrong here? This is just an F string. I just want to print out the value of the name key, the value of the house key in this dictionary, but your audio is a little garbled for us, but I think I heard double quotes and single quotes, so I'm going to assume that indeed you've identified precisely the issue. I'm just going to confuse Python right now. Even though this is an F string inside of double quotes prefixed with an F, I can't actually use my double quotes inside my double quotes because that's going to potentially confuse Python. Indeed, if I run this program now, Python of student.py, and hit enter, I get a syntax error. So the program didn't even run fully. It just couldn't be understood because it got confused by those double quotes. So the simplest fix here would indeed just be to use not double quotes, but single quotes around the keys, or conversely, flip the double quotes on the outside to single quotes, then use double quotes on the inside. You just want to be consistent. So a subtle detail, but again, this is now specific to dictionary syntax. This isn't fundamental to how we're solving this current problem at hand. All right, well, let's go ahead and try this. Let me go ahead now and run Python of student.py. Let's go ahead and type in Harry. Let's type in Gryffindor, and hopefully Harry is back from Gryffindor. No syntax errors, no other errors. I think I'm back in business here. And what I do like to be clear about using a dictionary is that it's allowing me just better semantics. Again, I don't have to remember, memorize, document that 0 is name, 1 is house. Instead, name is name and house is house. It's just a little clearer, a little more expressive, so that's generally a good thing, especially if we stored more data about students than just their name and their house. If you had 3 fields, 4, 5, 10 different fields, no one's going to want to remember or be able to remember forever which is 0, which is 1, which is 2, and so forth. Better to introduce names like name and house in this case. But let me tighten this up further. Indeed, I'm typically in the habit of not introducing variables unnecessarily unless they make the code more readable. And an alternative way to format the same code would be this. Strictly speaking, I don't need to create an empty dictionary, then add 1 key to it, then add a second key to it, and then return that dictionary. I can actually consolidate this all into one statement, if you will. Let me go ahead and do this. Let me go.
Şimdi buraya kadar bir durdurayım. Şimdiye kadar ne öğrendik? Bir tanesi işte bu printf, şu yazım biçimi. Bunun nasıl yapıldığını bilmiyordum. Bir dakika, Windows ile yapayım. CM'de Python var mı? Bak. Hemen Python download. Python'ı hiçbir zaman orada indirmeyin beyler. Evet. Kullanımı deneyeceğim. Tamam. Güzel. Ama şimdi name eşittir daha age eşittir 22. Buna string format age eşittir 22. Parents nasıl bir kullanım yapmıştı? F atıp şurada hatta F atıp şöyle mi yaptı? Daha is Aa! İşte beyler neden ide kullanıyorsunuz? Bunun cevabı budur işte. Name is here. Oldu. Aa çok güzelmiş lan. Ben bunu kullanırım ha. Tamam bu aklımda dursun.
Go ahead and say name equals inputs return value, house equals inputs return value, and then instead of returning any variable names.
En son şey diyorduk. Ne yapmıştık? Burada neyi öğrendik? İşte şu kullanımı öğrendik. İkincisi dictionary'de tam hakim değildim. Biraz bunu da öğrenmiş oldum. Sonra işte şu an object oriented neden lazım ona kadar götürecek. Ama ben biraz yoruldum açıkçası. Classes and Objects. Şu Classes ve Objects'te başlayalı zaten herhalde kaç dakika olmuş bakalım yayın. Yayın kaç dakikadır devam ediyor. Nerede yazıyor lan o? Nerede yazıyor? 40 dakikadır. Devam ediyormuş. Ben
Which I'm going to
yoruldum
propose
beyler.
doesn't need to exist anymore. Let me just create and return the dictionary all at once. Let me do quote unquote name in lowercase here, and then the variable, it's storing the user's name. Then quote unquote house as my second key, the value of which is going to be house, the variable. Now is this better? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the first way was a little more readable, and that's totally fine to create variables if they improve the readability of your code. But just know that you can also create and return a dictionary on the fly like this, so to speak, all in one line. And I think it's arguably pretty reasonable in this case. Why? It's just pretty short. I probably wouldn't do this if it got longer and longer and longer. I might minimally then start moving my key value pairs to separate lines. But this would just be a slightly more compact way of doing this as well. But let me propose we do one more change. Let's go ahead and introduce that same special casing of Padma to fix her house, from Gryffindor, for instance, to Ravenclaw. How do we do this with dictionaries? Well, dictionaries, like lists, are mutable. You can change what is in them just like you can lists. And how you do that is just a little different syntactically. So let's go back into main and do this fix. If the student variable has a name key that equals Padma, then, indented, go ahead and change the value of the house key inside of that student dictionary to be, quote unquote, Ravenclaw instead. So very similar in spirit to what we did with a list, but instead of using location 0 and 1, we're much more clearly, explicitly, semantically using, quote unquote, name and quote unquote house. Because you index into lists and tuples using numbers, but you index into dictionaries using strings, as I've done here. All right, let me go ahead and run Python. Student.py. We'll again do Harry from Gryffindor, and I think all is well. Let me run it one more time, this time with Padma, who in the movies is from Gryffindor, but should really be from Ravenclaw. All right, any questions then on this progression from tuples to lists to dictionaries? We haven't necessarily introduced anything new other than those tuples,
Bunu da öğrenmiş olduk.
which have been
Ama
available
şey,
to us all this time.
dictionary'ler.
But the goal at the moment is just to demonstrate this distinction among these different data types and how they each work a little bit differently.
What if a combination of lists is there in a tuple? So is the
In a
list
tuple.
like we can change the list because tuple are immutable, but lists are mutable.
Correct. You can change the contents of lists and
Beyler sonuç olarak ne? Listler mutable yani değiştirebilir. Tuple'lar değiştirilemez. Dictionary'ler değiştirilebilir. Yani mutable.
you can put most anything you want in them, other lists or strings as I've done, integers or anything else. Tuples, you can do the exact same thing, but you cannot change them once you've created them. A dictionary is more like a list in that it is mutable. You can change it, but the way you index into a dictionary is by way of these keys, these strings as we keep seeing, rather than by numbers. Those new
Çok güzelmiş ya. Çok inanılmaz bilgiler veriyor yani cümle aralarında. Tamamdır. Bugünlük bu kadar olsun. İzlediğiniz için